there's a whole new technology or field of technologies called neurotechnology that's all about that. How do we stimulate the brain through sound? How do we stimulate the brain through light frequency patterns? How do we stimulate the brain through, vibration patterns, like physical vibrations? It smells, right? So all of these neurotechnologies that are trying to hack the brain in certain ways to achieve those expanded states, those are what we call neurotechnology. Now, there's also the power within. You can use, for example, breath work, meditation, chants, your own voice, for the chanting, but in a rhythmic way, rituals, qigong and tai chi, right? All of these things are things that you can generate within yourself. They create what we would call, what in the ancient tradition, we call it internal alchemy, inner alchemy. Where your body actually becomes this alchemical factory, and it works with the endocrine system, it works with the energy field, it works with the nervous system, and it will stimulate the brain. So all of these spiritual practices, I call them tools for life. Yes, we have our sort of modern technological ways of hacking our body, but these ancient spiritual practices were very sustainable ways of accomplishing these neurosystems. Now, let's get into how the brain develops, because this is where some of what I keyed in on is unique, right? So I had this vision at one point of how do we really reprogram the brain? Because in our conscious mind, our intentional state, it works from what we call the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is the most human part of the brain. It sits right here behind your forehead. It's about 35% of your brain mass is in the prefrontal cortex, but it's the most human part of the brain. And that is where we have what we call our executive function, right? Our ability to choose, to discern, to be abstract, to set intentions, to be goal-oriented, and so forth. And so from our choices today, how can we then rewire the brain? And I had this realization that as I was studying the brain, that the brain develops in a certain way. It develops from the fetus. It develops from the bottom up, so from the deep brain stem up. It grows like a tree, and then from the back to the front. So the brain develops bottom up, back to front. And as we grew up, we were programmed with that development, right? So our foundation's in the brainstem, and then it grew up from there and forward from there. And those correlate with different phases of our life, different ages. For example, we have our late 20s, or early 20s is when our prefrontal cortex most developed. And then, you have your cortex in the teens, and you have your limbic system in your preteens. Oh, those are fun times. And then in your childhood and in infancy, you have the old brain and the brainstem. So depending on what was happening during those times in your life, that determined the wiring and the foundations of your brain. So if we want to rewire the brain, we need to work in the reverse order. We need to work from where we have conscious control, so from the prefrontal cortex, front to the back, and then from the top down. So we're going to trace our way through that sequence from the front to the back and then the top down. And this will then, as we do this, we're going to figure out which are the tools that we can use to support the different areas of the brain. So prefrontal cortex, as I just mentioned, is you can see here, it's the most executive part of the brain. They call it the executive center. And it's that frontmost part, right? And the whole just tapping on your forehead is going to stimulate your prefrontal cortex. It's what is most distinguishes humans, right? Our prefrontal cortex is, I think it's like twice the size of the lesser apes and 5 times the size of dogs, of the canine species. So we have much more executive control. And here is where intention, deliberate orchestration of our activities of the day, goal setting, all of these types of things happen here. And the prefrontal cortex actually is growing and developing from birth all the way up until 25 years old. And what it does, what's unique about the prefrontal cortex is that it hooks in to all the other areas of the brain so that it can control them. So what makes us most human is our ability to have this executive function. What makes us most animal is when we get into survival mode and our old brain hijacks our prefrontal cortex. So when we just go into reaction mode and we don't have as much control, self-control, and even though we think we should be rational, we can't, that is when our deeper parts of our brain are hijacking our prefrontal cortex. So we want to be able to maintain executive function. So that means we need to reconnect from the prefrontal down and back. And in the Taoist tradition, the whole brain area would be called what they say is the upper dantian. Dantian is like energy centers, really important energy centers that we want to develop. So when it comes to working the prefrontal cortex, first of all, we need to remember we have right hemisphere and left hemisphere. Right hemisphere and left hemisphere are, all about balancing, right? So most people are either right brain dominant or left brain dominant. They tend to either be more creative, like if the right brain, they tend to be more creative, more intuitive, more nonlinear, more emotional maybe, but very much in the capacity for relationships, and they learn through those dynamics. And then you have your left brain people who are more analytical, logical, language and numbers oriented, and so forth. So the ideal, I should say, is not to be right brain or left brain dominant, but to be whole brain, to have equal access to both left and right.